Hi, Misha here. And in the past, I have talked about this helicopter, the Sikorsky SH-3 Sea King, or in this instance, the Westland HAS-6 Sea King. This is the license-produced version in Britain, which first took to the skies in late 1969 and was in production and service by the 1970s. And I bring this one up because now I want to talk about what eventually replaced it. This is the Merlin, produced by Agusta-Westland in several versions for both the Royal Navy and Air Force, as well as the Italian Navy and Air Force. This model over here was from Corgi. This one is from Altea, who make more of a budget series, but as I've come to kind of appreciate them for the money, plus they do a lot of neat ones that other companies maybe necessarily do not do. So yeah. In the 1970s, both Westland and Augusta were producing the Sea King under license for their respective navies. In 1977, with the Sea King becoming about a decade old, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense started kind of thinking about the future and the eventual replacement of the Sea King. What would come next? Now, the Sea King had served as an anti-submarine, medium lift transport, general utility, search and rescue, just a naval kind of, very capable helicopter. And the new version would need to be able to do all that and then some. Well, both Westland and Augusta realized they had a common goal and a common need, so talks began on a joint project. Westland's initial proposal was known as the WG-34, and it was essentially a more powerful, more automated, more autonomous version, but it still had the same basic dimensions and whatnot of the Sea King. Well, in 1981, the British government got on board and kind of gave an initial budget to the forming partnership, which allowed them to build their first test models and prototypes. And Augusta and Westland would form a joint holdings company, EH Industries, which would develop, design, market, and retail and service the new helicopter. So work would proceed on the earliest versions in the early 80s, and then in 1984, the British and Italian governments would formally sign an agreement to purchase these. And so, by the Paris Air Show the following year, EH Industries had their first mock-up. Wasn't a prototype yet, but they had their first mock-up. But the first prototype would finally fly in October of 1987. And countries would start looking to place orders. Canada was early on interested, but politics got in the way, and eventually their order was canceled And actually, the end of the Cold War kind of delayed the program a good bit. Kind of got put on the back burner. There was a lot of budget cuts in the UK and Italy in the early 90s, and of course, other projects like the Eurocopter weren't going great. But that did give time to develop and kind of perfect the helicopter. And then in 1995, early on, around February, Britain placed an initial order, for 22 for the Royal Navy. And then in October of that same year, they would place an order through Italy, initially for 16. Later these orders would be upped. The Royal Navy would end up purchasing 44, and the Italian Navy would end up purchasing 24. Also, the Royal Air Force, the RAF, would purchase around 24. And the Italian Air Force, although they were kind of late to the game, would purchase a dozen. The first example was delivered to the Royal Navy in 1997. It entered into testing and trials. The next example would be given to the RAF a short time later, and then the first one would be shipped to the Italian military in 1999. In 2000, the Royal Navy would declare these operationally ready. The Royal Air Force would do so a year or so later, and there we go. These first started to see deployment in 2003 in the Balkans, the UK, and they were first stationed in Iraq in 2004. So what do we have? In Britain, this was known as the Merlin. The initial naval version was first declared HAS-1, but this is quickly changed to HM-1. This was an anti-submarine utility version. It could carry about 24 seated, fully equipped troops, or 30 or so, 35 standing troops. It could carry over 5,000 pounds of cargo internally. It could carry up to 4 guided torpedoes or depth charges. Of course, it had a sonar. It could be fitted with door guns, machine guns if necessary. This is a 3-engine design versus 2-engine for the Sea King. As you see, it has a 5-bladed rotor. This is kind of based on the burp rotor design used in the Lynx. It's a relatively large helicopter, of course, being a medium lift. It's over 64 feet long. The old Sea King was just under 56 feet long. So bigger, but not enormously bigger. The Sea King had a top speed of around 130 miles per hour, whereas the Merlin could get up to 170, so quite a bit faster. It also, of course, had much newer avionics, flight computer. It was easier for one pilot to handle if necessary, so on and so forth. It could also operate in a wide range of temperatures from 45 degrees Celsius, negative 45 degrees Celsius, up to 50 degrees Celsius, so very hot, very cold. It had a very state-of-the-art de-icing system, multiple fuel tanks, modern communication equipment, and the version that the Royal Air Force used was known as the HC-3. It was designed more as a commando type, kind of like the Sea King HC-4 and HC-5 commandos. It could carry up to 45 troops standing or 30 troops seated. Internally, it could carry over 6,700 pounds. Externally, under a sling, it could carry as much as 12,000 pounds under. It had the facilities and the deck ramp to have some, I wouldn't say light vehicles, but some vehicles go on board, including Land Rovers, small artillery pieces, things of that nature. It could also be fitted with extra fuel tankage, and it was capable of being refueled in the air, giving it a lot of great range. The helicopter was designed to be as survivable as possible. For example, too, when it was used in Iraq in 2004, this was used often as a medevac, and it could carry up to 16 patients on stretchers, or even more casualties if just seated. So not bad at all. That year they did find a problem with the original tail rotor design, so they had to ground the fleet temporarily. They went to a new tail rotor, which proved to be much safer, also more durable, less maintenance intensive, just an all-around improvement. Certainly a little upgrade. But generally speaking, these had a pretty good service record for being a helicopter, thanks really to that long development period. Speaking of the development, in 2000, Westland and Augusta merged, becoming Agusta-Westland, which basically invalidated the whole need for the EH Industries holding company, so that was dissolved. So what had been the AH101 project just became the AW101. The Merlin would continue to see use. The Royal Air Force would deploy these in Afghanistan. Although early on they found that another deficiency was it didn't really have ballistic armor. It wasn't really armored against small arms fire, and self-sealing fuel tanks were an option, but they weren't standard because this was never meant, at least necessarily from the outset, to be directly in a combat zone. Again, it was a maritime helicopter. So they had to retrofit their fleet of HC-3s with armor for the crew and engines, and this was completed by 2010. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, would continue to use these to support operations in Iraq. They would also use these to assist drug interdiction task forces over on the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean, and also provide disaster relief to hurricane victims. So they were used for humanitarian roles as well. Italy itself would deploy 3 101s to Afghanistan in 2010. And by this point, the older Sea Kings and Sea King, the commando versions, were being retired out at an increasingly rapid rate. But by 2011, Britain was winding down its commitment in Iraq and then eventually Afghanistan as well. Now, interestingly, by this point, the Royal Air Force, the RAF, was going to retire its Merlins, and a deal was struck to transfer them to the Royal Marines. Also, around 2012, the Navy was planning an upgrade of its HM1s to a new standard, HM2, which is basically a technology upgrade. They would go to a new cockpit, more advanced cockpit design with more digital layouts. They would go to a new mission computer. For the naval version, a new sonar suite would be introduced, and a few other little changes like that. This would become the HM2. And when the RAF HC3s were being transferred to the Royal Marines, in addition to having the required updates so they could operate off of naval vessels introduced, they would also receive the modernization package, or at least a very similar one, and this would result in the HM4 or HC4 as some people write it. Either way, prototyping and all this would be done. There was an official handing over ceremony in 2014. The first prototype flew in 2017. And last year, 2018, the Royal Marines took delivery of a couple of dozen, essentially refurbished and upgraded former RAF Merlins. And that was when they retired their Sea King commandos. The Royal Navy pretty much retired all of their Sea Kings in the HAS anti-submarine patrol role by 2016. So just recently, the old Sea Kings were out of service, and the new Merlin was in service. Now, originally they were also planning to retire the Lynx and its variants, but it was decided a few years back to go ahead and keep a couple of Lynx variants around and not just have a purely all Merlin fleet. The helicopter has been reasonably successful. Over 200 have been ordered. Another somewhat major user is Japan, who adopted it as the AW101. They purchased 14 for the Japanese Navy, with the first ones delivered in 2006. Some components are made locally, and the helicopters have been assembled locally to some extent, much as we've seen with other Japanese aircraft. They had been using the Sea King as well as the Seahawk prior. So, of course, this is still very much in service today. It's a big, modern helicopter. This model here from Altea is actually from the Italian Navy. I would have preferred a British example, but beggars can't be choosers. Same basic helicopter anywho. And these are very reasonable priced for the quality. Around $30. These are die cast. A larger one like this is going to have a little more polymer on it. And the tail, for example, of course the rudder blades are, but the front part is metal. Pretty neat. Wheels don't rotate or anything, but the blades do, so yeah. Including the tail rotor. So I figured why not pick one up. Kinda neat. Kinda neat. But yeah, I have a thing for British helicopters. I have a thing for helicopters in general, but especially RAF, British Army, British Navy. So I thought I would share with you. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.